Okay. Let's just remember where we are. What I'm doing is trying to get through the big sweep of history related to efforts at health reform in the United States from the turn of the century, from 1904's big landmark event, the publication of Rubinau's paper, to 1965, roughly a 60-year period. We're going to come back to the period from 65 to the present later in the course. We wanted to get through this period in two phases. First, I covered the period from 1904 to roughly 1920, and then I began to pick up from 1920 to 1965, the very significant legislative passage of Medicare and with it, Medicaid. In both cases, I'm trying to weave together a tapestry, if you like, of many different threads and strands. The basic threads that I'm using are very important material in the textbook that I am sometimes reordering to make it, I think, a little bit more coherent and chronological, but there is important material in the textbook. And once I create a framework from textbook material, I go back and incorporate material from handouts and from Blackboard readings. And we covered that pattern for the period from 1904 to 1920. And then we started working on 1920 and 1965, getting through most of the landmark events that are recorded in Shi and Sing. I pointed out that Shi and Sing sometimes put things in odd chronological order, so I re-established the actual chronological order in covering the high points in Shi and Sing, but I haven't yet begun the process of weaving together material from the handouts and from the Blackboard readings. We had gotten as far as 1957 in our look at Shi and Sing as our first approximation. 1957 was the passage of, well, not the passage, the introduction of the Foran Bill, named for legislator Foran, who was its author. And this is described on page 104, upper left, in Shi and Sing. This is what they say. Government assistance for the poor and elderly was sought once it became clear that the market alone would not ensure access to these vulnerable population groups. A bill introduced in Congress by Amy Forand in 1957 provided momentum for the including necessary hospital and nursing home care as an extension of Social Security benefits for the elderly. The AMA, however, undertook a massive campaign to portray a government insurance plan as a threat to the physician-patient relationship. The Foran bill was stalled, but public hearings around the country, which were backed by the elderly, who came out in large numbers and became increasingly well organized as a very important political force, produced an intense grassroots support to push the issue onto the national agenda. So that Foran bill and the background maneuvering that lay behind it is the real initiation of what's generally called the Medicare strategy. The United States, unlike other countries, unlike European countries, which had moved, many of them, towards a universal, across the age spectrum, national health plan. In the United States, instead, the closest we were coming would be a plan that would target the elderly, those over 65. This emerged as a political strategy, as a practical necessity, because everything that had happened up to that point made it very clear that the United States would have a great deal of difficulty moving to a universal across the age spectrum program. The market forces, through commercial insurance, through specially negotiated arrangements between management and labor, was spreading the insurance coverage for employees and their families. And that was fine for that group of people, but it left out the poor, the unemployed, and the elderly, who were, of course, often also poor and unemployed as well as elderly. And so the strategy began to develop. Some very, very clever people in government, deep in the Social Security Administration, began to come up with a strategy. Let's target the elderly, and let's see if we can get the United States an unusual, by international comparison, very strange, universal program for those who have reached retirement age. This was the Medicare strategy. There were other major developments that are also mentioned on page 104, some of which I've just read to you. One was the AMA opposition. AMA opposition had been extremely strong from 1920 on, and it remained strong when this alternative formulation was being devised as a strategy to get around some of the opposition. The AMA saw that and really armed for combat with proponents of the Ferrand measure. If you read further on page 104, there are some other things which are mentioned. And I can just point you down further the column on the left in 104 and the top of the right-hand column as well. Here are some of the things that are mentioned. There's a Kerr-Mills bill, and then it becomes enacted. Ferrand's bill never was passed. Kerr-Mills, 1957, introduced in 1960, did in fact pass. She and Singh characterize it as a compromise measure. And I will make the case that it was not a compromise measure. It was an alternative, a deliberate, carefully constructed alternative to the Ferrand bill, and was meant to try to stop the growing momentum, the support for Ferrand, and deflect it into another pathway. There's also mention on page 104 of the role of Lyndon B. Johnson. Remember, Johnson became president in late 1963 after the assassination of John Kennedy. He had been Kennedy's vice president. The assassination plays a role in the story. Johnson plays a major role in the story. Kennedy had campaigned in 1960 against Richard Nixon as his Republican opponent. By supporting the Ferrand bill, Medicare as a general strategy, Nixon was opposed to it. Kennedy won by a very slim majority. And Kennedy had additional problems in pushing forward that legislation and other legislative initiatives, not only because he had won by a slim popular majority, but because even though there was a Democratic majority in Congress, it was a funny Democratic majority, and that a significant portion of it, and the senior leadership of it, was made up of Southern Democrats, who were very different from the Northeastern and Middle Western liberal Democrats. They were very conservative, and later many of them would actually leave the Democratic Party and become Republicans. They were called Dixiecrats at the time, representing the South. And because they were reelected so regularly by the seniority rules of Congress, they often occupied very important committee chairmanships and could control legislation, keeping legislation that they didn't like bottled up very significantly. Johnson was identified as a Southern politician. He was from Texas, and he shared a lot of the values of the Dixiecrats, but in certain important ways he broke with them. He saw himself as a New Deal Republican. He was elected when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president during the New Deal. He had somewhat different ideals, and he was able to do things and say things to his Southern colleagues that Northern liberal Democrats weren't able to. So Johnson plays a crucial role in this story. There's also mention, just passingly on page 104, of something called elder care, which the AMA began to support. Elder care was an alternative to the Ferrand Medicare measure, which by the early 60s had a different sponsor. Ferrand was no longer a key player. It was now known as the King-Anderson bill, introduced under the Kennedy administration. We don't need to worry about all these names. The essential components of the measure were the same. But the AMA realized that it couldn't just oppose negatively. There was really a groundswell of support for Medicare. Many very important political players were getting involved. Organized labor was getting very much involved. And so the AMA proposed what it called an alternative. Instead of having hospital insurance that would be mandatory, that would be supported by mandatory payroll deductions, just like Social Security, as an extension of the Social Security principle for hospitalization as the main feature of the Medicare measure, they proposed voluntary contributions through private insurance companies, through commercial insurance companies, primarily to pay not hospital bills, but doctors' bills. And this was called elder care in their literature. And elder care picked up congressional sponsors too. So there were some who were promoting the administration's measure for Medicare. There was resistance in committees led by Democrats, but by Southern Democrats who didn't want the measure to get out of committee. There were complicated alternative measures that got introduced. The AMAs supported elder care measure, and it developed its own following. So eventually, when Medicare and Medicaid passed in 1965, it was the result of very complicated political strategies and alternatives and machinations. And what was produced was what was called a three-layered cake, in which these various measures that were really introduced as oppositional measures to thwart the passage and the gaining of support of others were blended and melded together into one three-layered cake, it was called, with the original Medicare measure as one layer to provide hospitalization, which is funded by mandatory payroll deduction and is available for those who have reached Social Security retirement age of 65. There was, and that was Medicare Part A. Elder care got incorporated as Medicare Part B, that you could, in addition, if you wanted to, also contribute and pay for premiums to have essentially physician coverage, which is what the AMA was concerned about, less than hospital coverage, and that was built in as Medicare Part B. And what had been introduced, and I'll come back to this in more detail, the Kerr-Mills Bill and Act, as an alternative to the whole program, was actually expanded and made into Medicaid as another measure. And so when Medicare passed, Medicare actually passed as Title 18, meaning Amendment 18 to the original Social Security Act of 1935. And when Medicaid passed, it was passed as Title 19, or Amendment 19 to the Social Security Act of 1935. That you can get as a basic outline from, if you put them in proper chronological order, the materials that are presented in She and Sing. But I want to go back and do a little bit more of a fine-tuned version of that with some more text and context. And for this we need to go, as I've said, to the handouts and to the blackboard readings. Here are some of the things that you'll get from the handouts and the blackboard readings that are left out in the She and Sing account. It leaves out, for example, though it mentions, but it leaves out the depth and significance of the virulent AMA promoted, but not AMA exclusively promoted, Red Scare attacks on socialized medicine. That political maneuver played a major role in the whole history of struggles for any kind of national health program, and played a major role in the efforts to create even the alternative, what you might call the very selective version of national universal health insurance by focusing on those over 65. Red Scare tactics promoted by the AMA, joined by other conservative organizations, joined by conservative members of Congress, was a very important and ongoing piece of the story that we need to pay attention to. There were some who had courage and stood up to that red-baiting, socialistic kind of attack. It took a lot of courage to do so. And one of the values of the Derrickson article that I've included in the readings and that you can get available on Blackboard, Health for 3/3 of the Nation, Public Health Advocacy of Universal Access to Medical Care in the United States. This article by Alan Derrickson makes the point that within the medical and public health community there were very serious splits. They have organized medicine represented by the AMA was strongly opposed to any of these universal measures. Organized public health represented by the American Public Health Association, a quite different organization with different values, different cast of characters, different political agenda, which had begun in 1872. The AMA went back to 1847 and was gaining force and respect and visibility in the 20th century. There were leaders of the American Public Health Association who already in the 1920s came out in support of a universal national health program despite the attacks on it as red-generated, socialized medicine that was un-American and the like. He talks about one very prominent Englishman, a man called Arthur Newsholme, that's Newsholme, who was a leader of English public health, who was invited to the United States, did a very important tour, gave many talks, spoke to the American Public Health Association, spoke at many universities and beginning public health schools, very strongly promoted the national health system that had already been developing in England, that dated back in England to 1911. So Newsholme was an important spokesman for it, and there were many Americans who admired his courage and his leadership, and they began to pick up that same theme. Newsholme is mentioned, if you look at the Derrickson article, pages 180 to 182. One of the Americans who was very influenced by him was someone who was a career public health person working for the U.S. Public Health Service. A man called Harry Moore, M-O-O-R-E, who took up the commitments of Newsholme, adapted them to the American context, found ways of using the American Public Health Association, the U.S. Public Health Service, and the new entity that was created, which I will get to in a moment, as a major sort of springboard for promoting something like a public health program of this very broad universal kind in the United States. More is mentioned on page 184. But probably the most important American public health leader who became a real defender of the efforts to get a universal health program was a man called C.E.A. Winslow, who was trained in bacteriology and sanitary science. He became a professor at Yale University. He created Yale's public health program and made it one of the most prominent in the country. He became editor of the Journal of Bacteriology. He also became editor of the American Journal of Public Health. And he was elected president of the American Public Health Association in 1926. He gave his presidential address in 1926, which he called Public Health at the Crossroads, and contained within it a strong message saying that we must not be intimidated by the kinds of propaganda that's being generated by the AMA and the language that's being thrown around to dissuade Americans from pursuing a program such as Newsholme has presented that makes a lot of sense. It has already been implemented very successfully in England and in other European countries. If you look at the Blackboard reading by Winslow, which should be available to you as indicated on the syllabus, towards the end of it, you will find very, very stirring language by Winslow. And let me quote from some of what Winslow says from page 1647 of that reading. This is his presidential address to the American Public Health Association, making it very clear that these two major professional organizations, APHA representing public health, AMA representing medicine, were at loggerheads, saw the world very differently, saw their agendas very differently. And that battle continues in many ways right through the 20th century, and there are even traces of it now, though there have been some muting of the opposition and some meeting in the middle. 1926, it was pretty oppositional. And this is what Winslow says in his presidential address. In Germany and England, national health insurance has been adopted as an official program. And a recent visit to England by me, that is by Winslow, has convinced me that, thanks to the increasing supervision of the Ministry of Health, the plan is working better in that country than its unsympathetic critics, of whom I previously had been one, would have us believe. So he is confessing, I was taken in by the AMA-generated propaganda, but I've been also influenced by my English column newsroom. I went and looked for myself, and I'm now going to admit publicly that I was in error about the faults and failings of the national health system. I think that it's working just fine. The same movement that we see in England is spreading with astonishing rapidity throughout Central Europe, though in certain countries such as Yugoslavia, against the violent opposition of the medical profession. So he's making it clear that the struggles in the United States between the public health advocates and the medical profession is not unique to the United States. We find that same kind of oppositional antagonism in other countries, but in countries like Yugoslavia, the forces of moving forward triumph over the pushback by the professional forces. And then he makes a very pointed comment that's very relevant to the American political context and the use of these labels and these slogans and these banners to discredit the national health agenda. This is the habit. This is bottom of the middle column, page 1647. The habit of condemning any attempt at intelligent community action by labeling it as socialistic is unworthy of serious-minded men. Some things are better done by the individual, some better done by the state, and catchwords will not help us to determine to which class a given activity belongs. In short, the organization of medical care for the whole community is better done by the state or state agency, and to simply label that and condemn it and dismiss it as socialistic and red and Bolshevistic and all these sorts of things is cheap shooting. It isn't real intelligent debate. It isn't a fair tactic. And we should expose it for what it is. We should expose it for manipulation and misrepresentation. Along with Moore, Winslow became an important leader of a new initiative that was tried by, there was strong philanthropic support, 8 major philanthropies, including the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, Commonwealth Foundation, others, put together a consortium to support what was called the CCMC, the Committee on the Costs of Medical Care, which began operation in 1926 and 1927 and continued until 1932. Winslow was the chief of staff of the CCMC. Moore was one of the major executives who pulled it together. The actual members of the Committee on the Cost of Medical Care, like members of the AALL before it, were drawn from philanthropy, social science, medical leadership, public health leadership, business leadership, progressive forces that want to see something done about the U.S. health system. They went about their work very systematically. They looked into all sorts of organizational and financial problems in the American system. And in 1932, after 5 years of work, they closed shop and said, all right, here's our final synthetic report. They issued maybe 30 other reports on specific subjects, highlighting particular experiments and new ways of doing things in American medicine in this community or that community, and then pulled it all together into their final report in 1932. The CCMC was deliberately middle of the road. It tried to be extremely cautious. When it recommended that communities consider the possibility of group insurance, or when if the nation would consider the possibility of moving towards a universal system, that it be done very carefully, slowly, that the movement forward acknowledge local variations and special considerations, and instead of rushing into a legislative program, try experiments around the country. It was very deliberately moderate and mainstream and cautious, knowing the political environment in which it was working. They knew, the leaders of the CCMC, like Winslow, that Isaac Max Rubinow, who was still in the country and working, as you may remember, in Cincinnati as the head of Jewish philanthropy, was the country's leading expert by far in social insurance, would be the most knowledgeable person to include in any deliberative body considering any kind of movement to national health insurance, even at an experimental basis with different local variations. But they deliberately excluded Rubinow from the CCMC. And the only possible explanation for that is that it was a political decision because they knew that Rubinow had too much of the taint of socialism, too much of the taint of the red baiting that had surrounded him and driven him out of employment by the AMA in the 19-teens. So Rubinow was left out of the CCMC. They were extremely cautious. They were deliberately middle of the road. And yet, that did not stop the AMA from ramping up its quite scurrilous, red-baiting attack on anything that even looked like it might be favorable towards national health insurance. If you look at the handout with Rubinow as the first slide on that, the first page, on page 6, we just have as a placeholder the title page of the CCMC final report of 1932. Came out in October, late October 1932. The AMA was ready for it. They had some members on the committee. They had inside information. There's a whole long, interesting story about the negotiations within the committee and so on. But the AMA was ready for this, and they were ready so that on December 3rd, barely a month after the report was released, they published an editorial in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, written by its fierce, combative editor, Morris Fishbein, who was one of the major antagonists to what was called socialized medicine. And this is what the editorial in JAMA said, carefully orchestrated. They not only printed in JAMA, they sent copies of this to hundreds and thousands of newspapers around the country, many of which just picked it up and just plunked it into print, so that the Chicago Tribune and whatever newspapers all over the country were printing the same editorial that had been pre-prepared by the AMA. And they say, they refer to the majority report because it's an internal battle, and it was a minority report written essentially by the AMA members of the CCMC, which wouldn't go along with the majority. So the report that Winslow and the other people in the CCMC, the vast majority of the CCMC members promoted, was labeled the majority report. The majority report, and then if you read down on page 7, skip down, it's written by forces representing public health officialdom, social theory, socialism and communism. A slide from public health to social science to socialism and communism, inciting to revolution. That's the typical AMA tactic of this period. The typical Morris Fishbein loose use of language to scare and intimidate. If it's supported by social scientists, it's tantamount to socialism and communism. it's tantamount to Bolshevism. It's all the same. It's the invasion, if you look down to the next paragraph, of governmental agencies into the practice of medicine. Third paragraph, repeat. This is incitement to revolution. These Bolsheviks of the CCMC, Winslow, Bolshevik, crazy. That's kind of language and tactic. The physicians of this country will not be misled by these utopian fantasies, etc., etc. There were huge battles throughout the 30s between the forces promoting intelligent consideration of at least the reform possibilities and absolutely adamant opposition. By the late 1930s, I mentioned last time, liberal Democratic Senator Robert Wagner from New York, who played a crucial role in the New Deal. He was one of the co-sponsors of the Social Security Act of 1935, a very important piece of legislation. He was the principal author of the Wagner Labor Relations Act, crucially important in the politics of labor and therefore of the New Deal and so on. Senator Wagner, by the late 30s, was beginning to sponsor measures to create some kind of national program. It was a Wagner-Murray-Dingell combination of co-sponsors. When the bill was introduced, it was the natural procedure to have hearings. And so there were hearings in Washington about the bill. If you look at page 8 of that handout, you see two of the AMA representatives who came to that hearing. It was in May 25th, 1939, is when the hearing actually took place. And the man on the left is, the man on the left is DC, I can't read it, it's sort of like Leland, Director of the Bureau of Economics, and then the other guy is also a strong AMA representative. They called the bill, the Wagner bill, which was modest and moderate, revolutionary, therefore Bolshevistic, therefore communistic, and so on. Now just look at those lovely faces. I did not Photoshop this. I did not go to Hollywood Central Casting to find villainous-looking people. But all I can say is, I wonder what's bothering the guy on the left. Must have stomach upset of some kind. Looks very sour. And I ask you a simple question. Would you buy a used car from the man on the right? Kind of weaselly guy. And these are the representatives before Congress of the Great American Medical Association condemning Wagner's proposal as communistic and socialistic. That was the style. There were those who continued to fight for government activity. One of my great heroes is a man called Henry Sigarist, page 9. That's the copy of a flyer of a talk he gave in Philadelphia in early 1939. Henry Sigarist was, by general recognition, the world's most respected medical historian. He was a great academic scholar. He had been recruited by Johns Hopkins from Germany, which is the source of great scholarship, as Hopkins knew, to head the newly created Institute of the History of Medicine, and headed that from 1932 to 1947. He also brought with him liberal ideas from Weimar Germany before the Nazis took over, supported national health insurance, became one of its great proponents, and thought that it was very important for him to take time away from his scholarly work and his editing work and his administrative work as head of the Institute of History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins, which was the most prominent such entity in the United States, to give talks to public groups and union-sponsored groups like the People's Forum in Philadelphia. His talk this day, as you can see on page 9, was, "Is the people's health a government responsibility? Should we have a national health program?" And Dr. Sigarist, with some of his credentials listed, was clearly answering in the affirmative. Sigarist became a major target for the AMA and for red baiting assaults. They went so far, his opponents, as to motivate a FBI investigation. The FBI opened a file and they collected all sorts of information. when I was working on the book that Liz Fee and I published on cigarette in 1997. We thought, as part of our background research and using the Freedom of Information Act and a favorable administration of the Clinton administration in the 90s, to actually get access to the FBI file. And I can tell you, based on my reading of the FBI file and my deep dig into all of Sigur's papers and letters and so on, most of which are in the archives at Yale University, and I've absolutely thoroughly examined and seen stuff that has never been published before. It appeared in some form in our book, that the FBI's investigation into cigarette was absurd, superficial. They could have made a much better case about cigarette sympathy for the left than they did. They just incorporated scurrilous, rumor-infested lies somebody said in the FBI file. I hope, for the sake of our country, that the FBI has become more professional since. Because since I knew, I think, almost everything that could have been learned about cigarette, after many years of research in archival materials, and then saw what the FBI file was after it finally got to us, 3 years of trying through the Freedom of Information Act, when it was finally released to us, in a highly redacted fashion, meaning lots of it was blacked out, but you could read enough to see that they were largely incompetent. But the point was that there was an FBI investigation that's intimidating. Sigarist, who was recruited during the war as a great European expert on European systems, was then fired from his job advising the government because of this FBI investigation. That's the kind of thing that went on, and people's careers were interfered with, and reputations were soiled because of this very important red baiting style. So, what are the possibilities? Possibilities surface in the 50s after the very intense red baiting attacks of the late 1940s. And we can see some of that in another handout. We were just talking about attacks during the 30s. They continued during the 1940s. President Truman, as we talked about last time, becomes the first sitting president, taking over after Roosevelt's death. As a supporter of national health insurance, he tries to promote it. And as soon as he starts promoting it in the late 40s, the forces of opposition, the red baiting tactics, are introduced again, and the cannons start blasting with heavy bore. So if you see in that handout, the one that has the cover of the Quest book as the first page, on page 2, we see President Truman trying to rally support in the middle of some very difficult post-war circumstances for national health insurance. And then the attack begins. So all kinds of political cartoons and other devices are used to decry the very modest Wagner measures as socialized medicine, as Bolshevik medicine. And there's this funny cartoon where the American hen, representing American medicine in that cartoon, is actually somehow hatching little quacking ducks. There's a species confusion here. So instead of little chicks, ducks are coming out because ducks are quacks, right? So this is a quackish, that's a little joke that they're presumably incorporating. And those quacking ducks, the odd offspring of American medicine, she's sitting in this hatching box of socialized medicine, and that's going to contaminate her brood and turn them into little quacks who are going to wade into the sea of political pollution. This was the typical kind of tactic and association, and even more striking and direct was this political cartoon representing another part of the campaign. There is innocent Sam, or Samson, remembering the biblical connection between Samson's long hair and his strength, and when his locks are shorn, he loses his strength. That's the reference here. There is sleeping Uncle Samson. He's fallen asleep and hasn't noticed the headline in the paper on his lap, Russia's aim to destroy the United States. And so it's part of a Cold War environment. It's part of external subterfuge and coalition and connection with forces on the left in the United States. There's this conspiracy, and so that hand on the right with a hammer and sickle on the sleeve representing the Soviet Union and the evil left forces of the Cold War are wielding scissors on which is written socialized medicine, and it intends to cut Uncle Samson's hair to destroy the strength and power of American medicine. That's the conspiracy. So any attempt to introduce something like the Wagner bill and make it into law, or any president supporting that, or any people in public health supporting that, are really part of a communist conspiracy that traces back to the Kremlin and traces back to the attempt to undermine the United States, sap it of its strength by allowing socialism and communism and Bolshevism to come in under the guise of this new medical reform. In this context, that's where we have the formulation of the Farran bill and the Medicare strategy as the only alternative. The Medicare strategy may be sort of a side door, the indirect way of creating a universal program, because there is a population, the elderly and the poor and the tired, who clearly are in need, are sympathetic, have strong motivation to organize together and to do something political. They begin to get strong support from organized labor and from other sources, and they begin to build a campaign for the Medicare strategy, which is the deliberate mechanism by which those who want the universal program will first try to get it by aiming at this population, seeing how far they get, and then hopefully generalizing that to the whole population. That's what Derrickson talks about in his article. That's what we talk about on page 20 of the handout I was just showing you. There's a very important cartoon that captures the political environment on the bottom of page 20. Congress people are talking to one themselves. There's an old gentleman in the background talking about old age hospital insurance. That's the Medicare strategy. He's looking interested in it. And the Congress people say to themselves, oh, just keep on walking. Ignore him. But the second panel, see how tall that elderly gentleman has become, representing the powerful political strength of their organization and their allies. And the Congress people become quite nervous. The Medicare strategy may indeed work. It has incredible support. Another indication of the kind of support that could build for the Medicare strategy is if you look at the Byrne et al. Article on pages 87 to 88. There is discussion of the growing support, the deliberate creation of allies, pushing for the Medicare strategy in order to make this the first step, the first movement towards a universal program. Organized labor is very actively involved. The bill that's introduced by the Kennedy administration, which is the King-Anderson bill, the successor to the Farran bill, is bottled up in committee, controlled by conservative Southern Democrats that don't want it out. And so the strategy is to put pressure on Congress, to put pressure on these committees, create public events and public embarrassment to try to move it. And one of these major embarrassments were a series of meetings at which President Kennedy spoke, urging support for the measure that was being bottled up in committee and not getting into the actual deliberations of Congress. This photo represents a meeting held in Madison Square Garden, May 20th, 1962. You'll see huge crowd, 20, 30,000 people filling every seat in Madison Square Garden. They're mostly elderly. They're well organized, they're vocal. Hanging from the second deck are banners saying Golden Ring Council, Golden Ring Society. These are political organizations that were the precursors of the AARP, and organizations like that which are incredibly well organized, very politically powerful, with huge support, huge budgets. And here the Golden Ring Councils were the pioneer versions of those with strong support from organized labor. And this was the kind of thing that was going on in the early 60s. In this context, we have to understand that Kerr Mills was not a compromise measure. Kerr Mills, passed in 1960 by conservative leadership, was meant to be an impediment to Medicare, because the premise of Kerr Mills is that we will provide, on a state-by-state basis, financial help for the poor elderly to get some kind of hospital coverage. It was meant as an alternative to Ferrand or King Anderson, which said, no, like Social Security, we want one uniform national measure, so that it won't matter whether you live in California or Illinois or Mississippi or Alabama or Pennsylvania. You will have access to the same uniform, decent, federally supported program. And the opponent said, no, we want to control the state basis. We want to make it part of welfare. We want only the poorest people to qualify. We don't want this as a general Social Security measure. So Kerr Mills wasn't a compromise. It was meant as the alternative. That's why it passed. If we pass Kerr Mills and make a welfare measure based on the states, then we will somehow stop the growing support for the Medicare strategy as a uniform new federal program that would be crafted as an amendment to the popular Uniform Federal Social Security Act. And what Congress discovered in the 60s, in the face of rallies like this in 62, and the growing support and the attacks back on the AMA as a negative force, as a benighted rather than enlightened force, was that Kerr Mills wouldn't be sufficient. It was meant as an alternative. It didn't stop the tide. The tide kept rising. And all this meant is that by 1964-65, there was a merging of forces in support of Medicare, in support of the administration's measure King Anderson, that would eventually gain support and have the majority. There were several events, I'll just mention these quickly, we'll have to pick this up next time, that contributed to that very dramatically changed political climate. One was the assassination of President Kennedy. Kennedy had always supported the Medicare measure. His assassination, in effect, gave additional support to it because there was a strong sweep of national sentiment that went something like this. We had some doubts about Kennedy. We had some ambivalence towards him. He did some dumb things, like the Bay of Pigs, invasion of Cuba, and all sorts of other things. There are some things we don't like that he did. He wasn't moving quickly enough in civil rights, whatever. But he is now our fallen president, shot down in his prime. We have to rededicate ourselves to his primary goals. And so if he wanted Medicare, there was a new surge of energy supporting it as a kind of recognition of this fallen, now seen as hero, president. And Johnson supported it. And Johnson could call upon his Southern strategy to push it against his former allies in the Dixiecrats. And then in '64, last thing I'll say today, the Republican candidate against Johnson, who was just the president, he became president by virtue of constitutional succession. When the president died, he became president, but wasn't elected on his own. So he ran first time as president on his own in 1964, November. The Republican opponent was Barry Goldwater. who was seen by many and portrayed by the Democrats as a very dangerous, trigger-happy, Holocaust-oriented, arch-conservative of completely irrational and foolish perspective. The American public was convinced because Johnson won election by a landslide. And in that landslide, not only did he win a new mandate for a much more liberal and progressive agenda, including civil rights, including Medicare, as part of what the public seemed to endorse with the very dramatic election by a huge majority of Johnson. But they also elected a very significantly Democratic majority Congress, with lots of new people being swept in and challenging for leadership the old Democratic Southern Guard. So by the end of '64, beginning of '65, there was a whole new political climate in the United States, and as it turns out in retrospect, a whole new possibility for actually creating Medicare legislation. And that's where we'll have to leave it now. Thank you for your patience. Staying here.